Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
With the COP26 finished, climate experts have been evaluating the outcomes and possible impacts of the Glasgow Pact, which was adopted by 197 parties late on Saturday. The pact requests that countries revisit and strengthen their climate pledges by the end of next year and aims to make deep cuts in carbon emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But the making of this pact came with much drama. In the 2 weeks before it was signed, developed and developing countries tussled around the issues of climate finance, loss and damage, and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015 and made it mandatory for parties to set climate targets to stop global warming. Even at the very last minute, India made an intervention that has since drawn criticism from several developed countries and smaller developing ones. At the closing plenary late on Saturday, India, with support from China, pushed back on a provision of the pact that called for the phase out of unabated coal power, changing it instead to a phase down. Unabated coal power refers to coal produced without capturing or storing the carbon that is emitted. When carbon is stored or captured, it reduces emissions in the atmosphere and can help slow down global warming. Developed countries said that India's intervention diluted the impact of the Glasgow Pact since coal is the most polluting fossil fuel. According to the UNEP's emissions gap report, if current policies don't change, the world is headed to a 2.7 degree rise in temperatures by the end of the century. But India stuck to its guns, saying parties should develop and deploy technology so it can transition towards cleaner energy. So what is the controversy over the pact about? What has the pact achieved? And is the pact a win for climate change? This video aims to answer those questions. My name is Simrin Sirur and you're watching Tipping Point. Though developed countries have been quick to criticize India, its intervention should be seen in its full context. Apart from asking for a phase down of coal, India also asked that this be done while providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable in line with national circumstances and recognizing the need for support towards a just transition. Basically, what India said was that developed countries must help developing countries transition out of coal and fossil fuels with adequate support. What this strikes at is at the heart of climate negotiations and is something I mentioned in episode 3 of Tipping Point 2. Common but differentiated responsibilities. CBDR recognizes that though all countries have a responsibility to address climate change, they aren't equally responsible for it and they aren't equally capable to act on it. Even a phase down of coal is a huge step for a country like India, whose development depends in large part on coal. Experts have said that India is doing more than its fair share when it comes to climate change, since its per capita emissions are much lower than the world average. India's per capita emissions are 1.8 metric tons compared to the global average of 4.4. They've also said that the outcry against India exposes the double standards of developed countries who rely heavily on oil and gas. Still, watered down or not, this is the first time a COP decision text includes the mention of scaling down coal and fossil fuel subsidies, which many say should be celebrated. Aarti Khosla, director of the strategic climate communications firm Climate Trends, called it an important indication of the energy transformation underway and a clear signal to markets and industry. Moving on to climate finance. Another notable part of the pact is that it asks developed countries to at least double their contributions towards climate adaptation. Climate adaptation essentially involves adapting to a changing climate, which could mean building more resilient infrastructure or installing better early warning systems. So far, climate adaptation has received a smaller share of funds from developed countries because it's considered less profitable. In 2019, developed countries only mobilized a little over $20 billion in climate adaptation finance over a span of 10 years. Now, the pact says that that number should be at least $40 billion by 2025. This money was part of a larger $100 billion that developed countries were supposed to have raised by 2020 to help developing countries cope with climate change. But they failed to deliver it and have said that they won't be able to do so before 2023. Though the failure of developed countries in raising climate finance has been called a disappointment, doubling climate adaptation finance in particular is a small win for developing countries, since during negotiations, developed countries vehemently opposed it. Developing countries are also disappointed that a facility for loss and damage finance which is money for when countries can't adapt to climate change, was ruled out in the final draft of the Glasgow Pact. Developing countries had proposed the establishment of a Glasgow loss and damage facility, which would mobilize funding specifically for this cause. Ultimately, however, the text only asks developed countries to help fund an existing loss and damage mechanism called the Santiago Network. The Santiago Network seeks to, quote, catalyze the technical assistance needed to address loss and damage, but doesn't mobilize the funds themselves. If you want to know more about climate finance and the negotiations around it, watch episode 3 of Tipping Point. On mitigation, the pact includes a number of provisions, all aimed at reducing emissions. It asks countries that haven't yet done so to announce net zero emissions plans by or around mid-century. Many developing countries have said this is unfair since it would come at the cost of their own development. Developed countries, experts say, should reach net zero before 2050 and allow developing countries to get there later, which is also in the spirit of CBDR. Whether the Glasgow Pact will actually help keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is something we still need to see. Alok Sharma, president of the COP26, was emotional when the conference came to a close. He said that though 1.5 degrees was alive, its pulse is weak and it will only survive if we keep our promises and translate commitments into rapid action.